So today, very excited to have a webinar with our three speakers. We'll be talking about three papers here that were published just not that long ago, within the last month, reproducibility and sharing across the social behavioral sciences. So before we get into each of the speakers being able to talk about what they did and what they found, I want to just spend a tiny bit of time on terminology, just so that we can all be on the same page. And that's using these three R words. We're going to focus on the topic of today on reproducibility, right? Which is using that same data and analysis strategy to see if you get similar results. But I want to make sure that people are aware that there are other types of R words out there, repeatable words that that might come up and that obviously are in the titles even of the papers that we're looking at, such as robustness, which is looking at different analytical strategies to test the same research question or hypothesis, or replication or replicability, which is asking that same question but with new data, different data from what was originally published. So today's is going to be on reproducibility. All three of these are important topics. So I just wanted to spend a little time here just to talk through this, so that way we can at least be grounded in similar terminology. All right, with that little note, let me get a little housekeeping here, which is we're going to have our speakers each have about a 10-minute time period to talk through their projects. I'm going to ask that you just put questions in the Q&A. That feature's on there. That's a much better place to put it than in the chat. And that'll allow me at the end to help the speakers moderate those questions. So ask the questions, fire away as you're listening to the three speakers, and we'll have about roughly 30 minutes, 25 to 30 minutes to be able to go through those questions, at least as many as we can, and hear from three speakers on their thoughts of what we're seeing kind of across the projects, or deeper dives into each one of their projects. So with that, I'm going to start with introducing our first speaker, or speakers, which is Catherine and Daniel, who will start us off. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. So let me share my slides. I hope you can see them. Okay, full screen. So thanks for having us here in this great panel. So this is a joint project together with Laura Schechtele, Daniel Krämer, and Josef Brüderl, and it's part of the MetaRep initiative funded by the German Research Foundation, which aims at analyzing and improving reproducibility across the social and behavioral sciences. So, and in our project, what is specific is that we use as a sampling frame not one specific discipline or one journal. We use a sampling frame and one specific data set. So we focus on publications, all using the European Social Survey data, which are classical observational data. So the survey is a repeated cross-sectional survey covering 39 countries, meanwhile 11 waves over 500,000 respondents, and in each wave we have hundreds of variables. So these are complex data which need a lot of pre-processing and complex analysis. There are a lot of degrees of freedom for the researchers, and this means that typically one needs the code to reproduce the analysis. At the same time, it's a publicly available data set, so data restrictions do not limit reproducibility here, and we have users across many disciplines, also covering disciplines which were not so frequently covered in other audits, like our discipline, sociology. And finally, we chose these data also because of their high relevance. The data are used for academic research, but also to inform policy. So therefore, one might say that reproducibility is here of particular importance. So we have three main research questions. In our openness audit, we ask whether authors share their code. In our reproducibility audit, are results computational reproducible? Meaning, first, we are interested in the conditional reproducibility rate, meaning can we repeat the findings when we rerun authors' codes? But we are also interested in the overall reproducibility rate, meaning we have code for a paper and in addition, we can reproduce the results. We are also interested when we find deviations, are these systematic? So again, we are here in this area of the repeatability framework and same data using same method, same analysis as the authors. And finally, we also want to explore discipline differences in our study. And for the research design as the sampling framework, we used the bibliography of the European Social Survey, and we used all articles which mainly used the ESS as the data base published between 2015 and 2020. We found more than 1100 articles. And what is also specific to our study is that these articles not only cover a broad range of different disciplines or Web of Science and subject categories, but also many different journals, including not only top-level journals, but also journals B and C journals of a bit lower level. And we contacted the corresponding authors of these publications and asked them for their code. We explicitly noted that data sharing is not necessary because the data are publicly available. And we also did an intensive web search for additional replication packages to these publications. And for our reproducibility audit, we randomly sampled 100 articles where we had data code available and tried then to reproduce the findings of authors using a very standardized reproduction protocol. And in this protocol, we agreed to really try hard to reproduce the findings. So for instance, we tried to fix some code bugs, or we tried to identify the exact ESS wave when this was not clearly indicated in the code. So therefore, we might estimate a very conservative or maybe a little bit more optimistic reproducibility rate. So results, first the code sharing rate, 35% of authors shared their code, 65% did not. For those not sharing, 13% were just not reachable, 60% did not respond, and some responded but declined. And so there were several reasons for declining. The most important reason was that authors just lost their code. But surprisingly, there were also several authors just answering, well, we did not use code in the first stage because, well, we did just standard regression analysis, for example, and therefore code is not necessary. For the reproducibility audit, we focused on authors' main findings. So we identified their main claims from their abstracts, and then we identified on average 7 different results in each article related to these main claims. And using authors' code, we could exactly reproduce about half of the results. And for some results, there were some deviations. And when we use a more lenient definition, counting also results which deviate by plus minus 10%, we could reproduce 36%. And for one quarter of results, we could not get any results reusing author's code. And reason for that were chaotic code. Very often some pre-processing was missing in the code, and then we missed just variables. Sometimes also some models were missing in the code, and sometimes authors used some additional data, and for us it was not clear which data were used. And just as a side note, even the successful reproduction were very burdensome. So in most cases, we needed some interventions. We had to fix some errors. If we would have counted these also as failed reproductions, I think the reproducibility rate would have been close to 0. So this was the result level, the conditional reproducibility. Recall that only about 1/3 of the authors shared code for us, and combining both rates gives an overall reproducibility rate. So code is available and we can reproduce the results of about 1 in 5 findings. On the article level, we defined reproducibility as we can reproduce all main claims approximately. So again, using the more lenient standard. And here the reproducibility rates are even a bit lower, which shows that the reproducibility issues are really widespread and not just concentrated in a few bad apples. We also investigated deviations. So this is here a figure on the absolute effect sizes. And the main finding is here that the deviations are mostly small and unsystematic. So a number of 1 would mean that the original and reproduced result are very similar. The figure is fairly symmetric. Suggesting that we don't observe a bias of original findings towards more inflated effect sizes or more significant results. And this can also be seen by sign switches. These rarely occur in our study. And finally, this is a distribution of the p-values. And we see a lot of variation between the original and the reproduced p-values. So not all observations lie here on the diagonal. But when judged by binary significance criterion, and most of these variations are inconsequential. So among the findings where we observe some switches in statistical significance and slightly more findings lose significance in our reproduction than gain significance. But overall, these cases are also rare. Discipline differences. This figure here shows the composition of disciplines in our sample. And the funnel shows the leakiness of our reproduction pipeline. So at each stage, some articles drop due to not sharing code or due to not being reproducible. And we can see that reproducibility issues are really widespread, but there are also some discipline differences, especially here in the first stage. We can observe that the share of political science increases, and this is because the sharing rate is a little bit higher in political science compared to other disciplines. So for instance, in management and science, it was only 18%, and political science is 46%. Given that code is available, the reproducibility rate, the conditional reproducibility rate is very similar across all disciplines. It's always about 50%. And overall, the reproducibility rate ranges between 26% in political science and 15%. So to sum up, we observe in our audit that reproducibility problems are really widespread. Numerical deviations are small and undystematic. Reproducibility issues occur across all disciplines, and reproductions are very resource intensive. So even the successful ones often required intensive detective work. And let me close with some recommendations. So even we did not do a causal research on this. I think we learned something by our audit. So first, we would recommend that data providers really should implement clear data versioning and require strict data citation from users. And very often it was very difficult to find out which exactly data version of the European Social Survey was used. Authors should invest in code quality and documentation, and ideally check the numerical reproducibility before submission using a different computational environment. Well, we already tried to increase awareness on these issues during the last years, so just more release might not be enough. So also institutional measures might be important, and here we think most importantly, journal editors should implement mandatory data policies. So in political science, there are more of these policies already in place. This is probably the reason why the code was better available. And journal editors should ideally also do some routine completeness checks, or even better, host data editors. And you all might contribute to enforcing these policies by not funding or maybe not reviewing articles which do not follow these open science standards. So thank you very much. And now I'm very much looking forward to learning more about the other very interesting studies.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. So we'll continue the presentations going. Katrin, you'll see that there's some questions in the Q&A. Feel free to answer the ones that are specific towards what you have. Absolutely, while that's going, if you're welcome. People keep continuing to add Q&A. But we're going to have our next speaker here. The floor is yours, Abel.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for everyone for being here, and to COS for organizing. I'm Abel Brodeur. I'm the chair of the Institute for Replication. And the project I'm going to present to you is joint work with a lot of people. Actually, it's way more than that. It's a very large number of amazing co-authors. And none of this is possible without their support and their work, obviously. And I'll explain later on in the presentation why there are so many co-authors and what they've done and how you can actually contribute in other projects that we have that are ongoing. We actually released this paper a couple of years ago as a preprint, and we've been working on ever since, trying to replicate more and more papers. So think of this as kind of a first step of what we were thinking of doing. So the Institute for Replication, I launched it in 2022, and the initial focus was on economics, political science, disciplines that I understand and I was interested in, as you can imagine. And the idea was, let's try to focus on top journals, but also papers that just got published. And that's one of the big difference between, I guess, our project and some of the other projects. We only look at papers that just got published. So we started in 2022. So we started computationally reproducing papers in 2022, doing robustness checks also on these studies. These are leading journals. Many have actually a data editor, meaning that at the conditional acceptance stage, there's internal computational reproducibility checks that are being done. The data editors or their staff they don't look for coding errors, they don't do robustness checks. But for many of the papers we are looking at, the completeness of the replication package, initial reproducibility checks were already done. So keep this in mind when I'm going to be talking about their results. And then later on, over the years, we started looking at psychology. So we have collaborations with NHB, Psych Science, in which we mass reproduce what they publish. And now we're moving into more topics. So if you're interested in one of the topics listed here, deforestation or pollution, tropical diseases, early life intervention, the effect of migration on the economy, reach out. So we have mass reproducibility projects on these topics, and we're interested in having other topics in the future. And I'll finish talking about AI if I have the time, but probably not. So the objective is what? So we're trying to mass reproduce journals. We're mass reproducing papers when they're published. And the goal is to change norm through this. If the economists and political scientists know that someone is going to look at their codes for coding errors, whether things are robust or not when you start playing with the codes, they change their behavior. It changes the norms. And that's why we want to collaborate with journals. We also always engage with the original authors to allow them to respond to the results that our teams find. So the goal, sorry, the goal is really to change norms through partnership with everybody that is kind of involved in the research process. So the paper that I'm presenting today, so we reproduced and did robustness checks for 110 articles. We find that most of them are computationally reproducible. That means from the raw data or intermediate data. From the raw data is about half of them, but it's just because the data sometimes cannot be provided or the authors only provided clean data, if you will. And when they provide either clean data or the raw data, we manage to just run the results. So you just run the codes and whatever Stata or SPSS or R or Python spits out, it's exactly what's in the paper, identical. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no coding errors. We do find coding errors in 20% of the case. And these range from very minor things, such as, I don't know, they say that they control for this, but actually they control for something else, but it doesn't really matter, to major catastrophic coding errors, which is more like 10% of the time. So there are duplicates. They say they do a difference and difference, but actually they forgot an interaction term and they only do a simple difference. Things like this, really major errors. So sometimes the results run, everything is great, and that's what, like, what's coming out of the code is exactly what you see in the paper. But that doesn't mean that there's no coding errors. So computational reproducibility here to me is something a bit different. Coding errors is something else, that data that they actually don't look at. When we do robustness checks, and we've done, at this point, I think we've done maybe 30,000 robustness checks. Now I'm showing you something like 6,000. 72% of the results remain robust, meaning it's the same sign, same statistical significance. So things are good, they're not perfect. And it's mostly the standard errors that change, the inference. The effect size remains quite similar, but the standard errors go up. So that's why many of the point estimates are not significant anymore. Then we do many analyst results trying to understand the determinants of robustness checks. I'll come back to this. The thing that seems to matter the most is the experience of the reproducer team. So if a team of reproducers is really experienced, they find that the results usually are less robust. But type of data provided, other things don't seem to matter too much for determining robustness checks. And as I said, we always try to engage the original authors. So I do all the mediation with the original authors. They're always allowed to respond, to provide feedback. Most of the authors respond, something like 95%. Usually they're happy because everything is great, there's no coding error and so on. Sometimes they're not happy, and usually it's because they disagree on the validity of robustness checks. This is where we find most of the disagreements. But most of the reproducer teams find that actually these interactions are useful to them. How do we generate like hundreds of reproductions like this? So each reproduction is like a 20, 30, 40 pages report about computational reproducibility, whether things are robust or not, whether there's coding errors. Like, it's a long report. So there's different ways. So people sometimes reach out to us, or we reach out to potential reproducers asking them, hey, can you reproduce this paper? If the data is not publicly available, we try to collaborate with Statistics Finland, Statistics Sweden. So when you need to work with data in a secure lab, and when the data, you need to buy it, we have money. So sometimes they pay replicators, hey, here's $5,000, buy the data, or I know it's painful to sit in a secure lab, so here's a compensation. So what you're going to see today, it's mostly results for publicly available data, but we have also ways to reproduce papers that use non-public data. And the other ways that we generate these reports is we have replication games, which is hackathons. So over the past 2 years, we've had something like 60 events all over the world with 2,500 people attending. They're PhD students or faculty or researchers with a PhD. So what they do, they sign up to an event, and we have tons of events this year. You can sign up. I think we have like 7 events over the next 6 weeks or something like this. You sign up to the event. 3 weeks before the event, I'm going to assign you to a team, or someone on my staff assign you to a team of people within your discipline, within your research interests. So if you're into American politics, or I don't know, child psychology or macroeconomics, we put you in a team of 3 to 5 people trying to mix PhD students and faculty. You choose a paper from a small list. And then during the day of the event, you check for coding errors, you run the codes, you do robustness checks. And then in the weeks after the event, you send me a report, which I send to the authors, et cetera, et cetera. So this is one of the ways in which we manage to generate so many reports. I'm going to show you some of the results. I don't have a lot of time, but this is basically results about whether the results are robust. So we do these thousands of robustness checks. So each team does 5, 10 robustness checks, let's say. And sometimes there's multiple outcomes or tables. So you can get to 50, 100, 200 per team, sometimes quite fast. But what this shows you is the x-axis is the original T statistics. On the left-hand side, so the vertical axis, you have the robustness checks, new test statistics. And what you see is that there's a lot of things that are significant initially. And when you do robustness checks, they become statistically insignificant. So as I said before, 72% of the point estimates become not significant at the 5% level, where they were initially significant at the 5% level. Sometimes they also switch sign completely, but that's quite rare. Which robustness checks matters? So that's something I've been obsessed about for years, and now we start to have a big database that allows us to answer this research question. Just look at the left-hand side of this graph. So this is for original p-values that were statistically significant originally, and then we look at whether it's significant or not. The red dot is what you want to look at. This is for all the robustness checks combined. The green is economics, blue is political science, but that doesn't really matter. So what we find, as I said, is 72% of the robustness checks find that the results are robust. But what seems to matter the most is when you change the definition of the code of the dependent variable. So if they say, oh, we look at mental health and we code it in a specific way, well, there's tons of ways you could code mental health. You could actually change it from a 2-point scale binary that they use to a 10-point scale, maybe because they just let's say it's life satisfaction on that 10-point scale. The authors decide to put it just as, are you satisfied with your life or not, as a dummy. You can actually use the full thing. You could do order probit. You could do this. You can change it in so many ways. When you do that, results are not robust often. They're robust 40% of the time, 45% of the time. Whereas when you change control variables, when you change the estimation method, when you change the controls, you change other things, it typically robust at like 76, 77, 78%. So things change depending on which type of robustness test you do. Here also, we have new data, so we've done replication. Sometimes it means that we just extend the sample by a lot of years. Sometimes it's just we collect new data in the lab when it's experimental methods. It's robust most of the time, actually. This is what we uncovered. We were quite surprised by this. Then we did the many analyst thing, and that's the last set of results I want to show you. There's more in the paper, interaction with authors and so on. You can have a look if you're interested. But here, basically, we had small teams looking at our big database of thousands and thousands of robustness checks. And we asked them 8 research questions. And we asked them to answer it the way they want. They choose the controls, they choose how they code things, et cetera, et cetera. Again, look at the left-hand side. This is the dependent variable is given, though. So it's whether the results remain robust or not at the 5% level. So the dependent variable is the same for each teams in this many analyst thing. And what they find, there's a bit of agreement on the experience of the replication team, reproducer team matters. The more they are experienced, the less things are robust. The pedigree of the original authors versus the original author of the replicators versus the original authors don't seem to matter too much. It doesn't seem to be like kind of a thing going on there. Whether the authors provided raw data or just clean data doesn't seem to matter too much. Most of the time, it's not significant. That's a gray bar. So there's not a lot of things that we could find that really helps explain which results are robust or not. So we're struggling a bit with this. We have a follow-up project in which we look at subfields. So within a field, when you compare like comparative politics versus international relations versus American politics, or you compare labor economics versus development economics, you see huge differences in robustness rates by method, RCT versus IV, diff and diff, etc. For those of you who are from these two disciplines, you know what I'm talking about. Huge differences in robustness checks. But in terms of like author experience, replicator experience seems to matter. Author experience doesn't seem to matter. Type of data provided doesn't seem to matter. Or at least there is no agreement between these many analysts. So to conclude, do we have a reproducibility, replicability crisis in the social sciences, let's say? I think it depends which field you look at. I think it depends which year you look at. We're in a better shape than before. If you look at top journals and economics, political science, I don't think we do have a problem. If you look at lower ranked journal, we have a problem, Houston. If you look at public health, which we do right now for tropical diseases, we have a massive reproducibility crisis. So I think it really changes depending on your target as a researcher. What are you interested in? Which journal? Which year? So it varies a lot. That's my experience. But what I do believe deeply is When people come to these events and they do reproductions with us, they get co-authorship to this paper I just presented. And that's the main reason why they do this. Most people don't get paid for doing this. Um, but they get something else more than a publication. I think it makes them feel better, actually. And most people will look at these data and codes of other people. They don't find coding errors. Things run. And later on with this survey, we asked them, like, does it make you feel better? Like, you have a more positive view of the discipline? And most people said yes, or just like, nah, sort of indifferent. A minority actually said, yeah, actually, it's much worse than I thought. So I think these projects like this are kind of interesting because you get tons of people into a room doing an hackathon and they get something out of it, which is great. But I think it also makes them feel better in general. We have also, that's coming, this last thing I'm going to say, AI replication agents that are coming. We're going to release them in June. They're going to be freely available. You're going to be able to use them to computationally reproduce your paper in a fraction of a second, checking for coding errors, doing robustness checks. So that's coming in a theater near you very soon. I'm done.
Wonderful, thanks. Oh, I love the flyer at the end too. Now I want to go to that movie, the games. Uh, Same thing as before. We're going to go to the next speaker. Abel, there's a couple questions. If you feel like you want to address those, go ahead. While Andrew, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thanks all for being here. So I'll present some data today and findings from a new paper that we just published. But I want to start first with stepping back for a second and asking why we care about this in the first place. And I think it's an implicit assumption of most of what we do when we read quantitative articles that we assume that if we take the analysis as described in the paper and apply it to the data as described in the paper, that we will get the exact same results. And I want to make the stronger claim that others have also made before me that um, if this wasn't the case, a lot of the other discussions we have about replication, robustness, the calibration of evidence to claims, they wouldn't be that meaningful if we didn't have confidence that the actual finding we care about was precisely and accurately reported. So in this sense, reproducibility, it's a foundation of credibility, right? It is kind of a first step that enables the rest of the credibility assessments to occur. But based on evidence that we've just seen here today and existing studies, we have reasons to question how widely this holds and under what conditions it holds. So that was a context for the research that we recently published. You can see the citation there. And this research took place in a larger context of a study or studies about the credibility of social behavioral sciences under the guise of the SCORE project that people might have heard about. And the SCORE project really sets the parameters that our investigation will work within. So just to briefly give an overview of this, we sampled nearly 4,000 papers from a 10-year period of '09 to 2018 across 62 leading journals in social behavioral sciences. You can see the disciplines I've listed here. From those nearly 4,000 papers, we extracted claims and evidence that were the basis of more research. And specifically for our purposes here, we subsampled 600 papers across journal year for further tests on repeatability, which could be replications, which we won't discuss here, robustness tests, or reproductions, which we will discuss here. Okay, so what did we do? So we took two approaches with these 600 papers. And the first was just trying to assess whether the data and code from that paper could be used could be obtained. And we did this by scouring the paper and looking for links and references to either journal websites, third-party repositories, or author websites. We did some web search too in these parameters to see if we could obtain data and/or code. And if we couldn't, we would reach out to the authors to supply it directly. This kind of results in two key measures of data and code availability, which are, is it available online, is it shared on request, or is it not available? We added a further nuance in the data to ask whether the data was restricted, either in all or in part, which is, as we'll see, is more common in some fields than others. And this could take three categories. It wasn't restricted, all of it was, some of it was. So that was the material availability portion of it. We also attempted to reproduce findings at the claim level um, uh, across 150 of these papers. And altogether, this resulted in nearly 200 studies that reflected 555 claims from these papers. And these reproductions occurred with varying levels of material availability. So in the ideal case, where data and code was made available, we could use that as part of the reproduction. If we only had the author data, then the analyst would supply their own code based on the description in the paper. And in other cases, especially those relying on secondary data sources, the analyst would reconstruct the data from those sources based on the description of the code, and likewise run their analyses based on the description in the paper. This resolved into, for each of these sort of claim level reproduction attempts, into five possible outcomes that I'll discuss more on the next slide. But just briefly, a finding could be precisely reproduced, approximately reproduced, or not reproduced. It could also be not evaluated, which I'll discuss more in a second, or not attemptable, which means that the analyst thought they had the author supplied data and code, but when they actually went into the materials, they were insufficient. Something was missing. Something prevented them from even trying to reproduce it in the first place. Okay, so how do we actually assess reproducibility? Well, as I mentioned, we have these three categories of precise, approximate, and not. And we assess these across five different measures that might have been reported in the original paper. The sample size in focal analysis, the coefficient in a regression context, if it was a regression context, a test stat for the critical test, the effect size, and the p-value. For the first four of these, it was the same kind of inference criteria. Um, Precise means after rounding, it was the precisely the same results as what was reported. Approximate is within 15% on either side. Not reproduced is more than 50% on either side. P-values are slightly different. For p-values, if it was reported precisely, we asked, is it the exact same p-value that was reported? Or if there's a threshold, is it underneath that threshold? So is it less than 0.05, less than 0.1, whatever. For approximate, we're looking at, is the p-value in cases where it was reported exactly, is it within 0.05? And again, not reproduced as more than 0.05 away. So we use these five assessments when they're available to come up with an overall outcome for each attempt. So if all of the available measures were precisely reproduced, it was a precise reproduction. If at least one was approximate and the rest were approximate or precise, it was approximately reproduced. If at least one was not reproduced, so a sample size or a coefficient or so on, then the whole thing was considered not reproduced. And if none of the original, if the original study didn't report any of these five measures, then the analysts still had their own pre-registered inference criteria for what would count, but we didn't evaluate those as part of what we would report because we wanted to keep it systematic across all studies. Okay, so let's start with just this question of data code availability. So what you're seeing here is results by discipline for different combinations of data that was made available online, by request or not available, and whether code could be obtained as well. And the darkest blue bar is kind of the gold standard. This is when data in open were available without any of our intervention. We didn't have to ask authors to supply it for us. And then the various shades of blue are cases where data was available, but not in quite that ideal state of independent of our intervention. Red I'll call out as the opposite. So there's no data, but there is code. And purple, which we really only see in large portions in economics, is cases of restricted data, whether it's sensitive or otherwise proprietary. And then across the board, gray means we couldn't find data or code. So some takeaways here. So we're seeing, as we saw in first paper that was discussed, that political science and economics really stand out for having the highest proportion of papers where data and code is made available without any of our need to request it. And as we and others have suggested, this is largely due to policy reform in these disciplines that have where journals either encourage, require, or verify that these resources are shared along with the published paper. We see a fair bit of sharing as well in psychology and business, but this is in this lighter blue category, which is where it was shared directly with us on request rather than being made available. And we think in psychology and business, this reflects increasing norms around open sharing. People are more willing and see the value of this. Um, but again, it has to be on request. It's not quite made it through to the level of journal policy to the same degree as it was in political science and economics. And again, for all but two of these disciplines, um, less than half had data or code available. Okay, so there's these two data collection efforts, right? Trying to see if data encoder was available and actually reproduce the findings. They were related, but they were not dependent because analysts could reconstruct source data in situations where that was possible. So meaning it didn't require author data and code to conduct reproductions. But what we see here is that the actual reproductions we could do were strongly shaped by the materials that were available to us. So you'll see here for each discipline the number of papers in that sample of 600, the number of papers that had at least one reproduction attempt, and the percent that had repro attempts. And as is quite clear, political science and economics stand out. Again, we think because of policy support. And really in political science, we were able to conduct reproductions for over half, just over half of those papers due to the widespread availability of materials and the source data that they were based on. Altogether, from the 600 papers, we were able to conduct studies for 146 of them, which was about a quarter of the sample. Okay, so what did we actually find? So what you're seeing here is a summary of the results in the three categories I mentioned, right? Precise, approximate, and not reproduced, across the levels of material availability. So did the analysts work with the author's prepared data and code, only the author's prepared data, or neither of these? And was this reconstructed from the secondary source data? And there's a clear pattern across these categories. When authors made these materials available, we have very, very high rates of reproduction. Over 3/4 were precisely reproduced, and about 90% were reproduced either precisely or approximately. Even when it's just the author's prepared data and the analyst has to supply their own code or make their own code based on the description in the paper, we still see a fairly high rate of reproduction. About 3/4 of them are reproduced, but a much larger portion of those are only approximately reproduced, right? So they're within a range of tolerability, but not the exact same values. And then one level down, when the analyst goes back to the secondary sources, reconstructs the data based on the description of the paper and the code based on the description of the paper, then we see fewer than half of these claims and findings reproduce, and a vanishingly small portion of them are actually precise reproductions. Okay, so what to make of findings that don't reproduce? Do we think that this means that the findings are wrong or non-credible? Well, not necessarily. Right? I mean, this could be due to differences in data versions, differences in the computational environment. The analyst may have made an error, so they are not themselves a ground truth. Or the analyst may have been working with documentation that was not wrong, but just incomplete. Right? And the takeaway here would be that this does not necessarily mean that the finding is bunk or not credible or not valid, right? And to illustrate this, we do have a number of claims that were reproduced more than one times, and sometimes these have different outcomes, right? We always report the most precisely reproduced version of this, so we always go with the version that's closest to the actual reporting. But this is further evidence that no single attempt can tell you how valid or invalid the claim is, right? differences in the analysis approach can yield different results. Likewise, what does it mean if we can successfully reproduce the finding? Does that mean that it's automatically valid or credible? Well, no. All it means is that the results that are reported in the paper could be precisely recovered. But those findings still might be invalid or non-credible if it's the wrong analysis strategy, if the code has errors, as we heard from in previous presentations, if the claim is just misaligned to the research design, right? They're making causal inferences when it's not justified, or it's not robust to reasonable alternative specifications. So none of this is a direct indicator of credibility. What we think it does is that being able to precisely reproduce the finding means that you're able to actually scrutinize it carefully. You can investigate the credibility more rigorously. If you can't even reproduce it, then you have very little that you can do to actually scrutinize that finding. And finally, I'll indicate, or I'll close with what we might expect in the future. So you're seeing here the journal policies over time of these 62 journals that we drew papers and claims from. And so you can see that this 09 to 2018 portion is highlighted as the period that we drew articles from. And this was already the start of a period of policy reform, right? There's more policies requiring data in code and more more policies actually verifying that the results can be reproduced before a period of study or during the period of study than before. But there's actually been an even larger increase afterwards. And so in the case of code requirements among these journals, that's more than doubled since the close of our sample. And in the case of reproducibility checks, that's more than doubled. So, the findings that we report, we think they have lessons about issues of journal policy and author practice, but we also think that if we would redo the study for a later period, we do expect that we would see higher rates of reproduction corresponding to this further deepening and entrenchment of policy reform. So I will close here. Just some information here if you wanted to follow up, and we encourage you to please dig into this materials, scrutinize it, reanalyze it, help us make this the best it can be. So you'll see links to the slides, the DOI for the article, the ungated version, and a landing page for the project more broadly. Now we'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thanks, Andrew. Thank you all. And so I'm conscious of time here. So right now, anyone who has a question, please put that in the Q&A. We'll try to get through them as quickly as we can. But there's one that was answered, Daniel, thank you for doing that. And there's one that's outstanding. And I want you guys all to maybe some of you can weigh in on it. Just a question about how to report, how to go about these large studies, right? We just watched 3 huge studies that actually interestingly covers everything from, or at least sampling, from 2009 almost to present day, right? So which is really phenomenal to see this amount of data. But do you have any suggestions for people in the audience in terms of how to report this, how to go about this? Any tidbits, something that is maybe behind the paper, and including making it machine readable? I think that's one of the questions outstanding. So I'm just curious if either of you speakers have some insights from your projects on how to report this. Anything you want to try to jump in there, Andrew? Maybe one aspect, Andrew, that I'll call you out on is the question of like how much information we're allowed to share in these papers, right? We're looking at published literature. We know a lot of this is copyrighted. There's ethics behind it. So like what considerations on SCORE in terms of what we were able to make public do you think is worth considering and sharing?
Sure. So, I'll take that in one direction, which is say that we're very careful when we report these studies, that we are not kind of trying to make claims or inferences about the specific people in this study. These are all real papers and real authors. And so we have to document this carefully, right? We have to say which study that each of these attempts came from, but we are not trying to focus the authors or even like the specific disciplines as an object of scrutiny or derision, right? Our takeaway is that these are structural features of the research environment, right? It takes journal requirements, funder support to create more uh, to create research that's reproducible. And so when we report these findings, and especially the underlying data that reveals information about what authors did and didn't do, we want to be very careful that that's used appropriately to point the direction towards future reform and not point the uh, magnifying glass back on those authors themselves. That's not what we focus on or think is even important.
Abel?
Yeah, I wanted someone else to say this first because I'm going to say the exact opposite. Um, yeah, so we're trying to find, whether the results are robust and credible. We make that information available. So you can find these 110 reports. They're written. They're on our website. We disseminate them as preprints. The authors, if they responded, the response is publicly available. They're linked. Um, we're trying to change norms, but we're also trying to help people understand which study they can find credible and which study they should not find potentially credible. So we're trying to provide more information. The website is the Institute for Replication. So we make all of this publicly available, and I see this as research, not search. One big difference with Andrew and other projects is these papers were just published. So it's not like we're looking at something 15 years ago and start to criticize it using the lens of nowadays. I think I'm always a bit like, we have more knowledge now, we have better data, we have different norms. Whereas if it just got published and someone looks at it and find coding errors, I think this should be known. And journal editors mostly don't care. So this needs to be, you know, part of I think it's a scientific result. It needs to be known. We use the same data. The data and the codes were publicly posted on the journal's website. So from my perspective, there's no ethics there. If you do it at Management Science, to my knowledge, the only journal that blocks you from doing what we do. They mention that when you download the paper, you can criticize it, write a comment, but you can only submit the comment to Management Science. All the other journals don't have this. You can do whatever you want with the data and the codes. There's a DOI, and we look whether things are robust and credible, and that's what we do. And next time that a researcher does a project, if he had coding errors in a previous project, maybe he's going to have two research assistants doing the work instead of one, and they're going to code review. So my response and my approach and what we did in verification is kind of the exact opposite. So I'm glad someone else said the other response. There's different ways to think of this. I'm not saying the way that we do it makes sense or is the best. I think there's different approaches. Our approach is more, no, we make this publicly available, 100%. That's the whole point.
Yeah, and I'm somewhere in between the two of you because we could not use replication packages from journals in most cases. We had to contact the authors, and after consultation with an ethical board, it was clear that we are not allowed to single out some authors. Therefore, we only published aggregated data and results on our reproduction audit, but I completely agree with Abel, it should be possible to use the code and also to report on some coding errors we find in published studies. So what would be really important is that journals implement the norms. And another rationale for us was that we didn't want to penalize these authors who shared the code with us on a volunteering basis. And therefore, we also published only results on the aggregate. But it would be really great if it would become the norm that all authors would have to publish the code. And then, well, that's science, that we also try to correct some errors we might find in published work.
That's wonderful. Oh, Daniel, do you want to add something quick?
Yeah, just a quick note to highlight what Abel said. I think timing is really critical because if it's a current study and you find it contains a massive coding error that overthrows the entire results, basically, then that would be something you want out early for that specific paper on a paper level, because well, then it might prevent the wrong results from spreading. So just to reiterate that 10 years afterwards or 15 years after publication, the result would have proliferated anyway, and then it's probably too late. But I think timing is an important issue there.
It's wonderful. So we are almost at time. So I'm going to try to ask one more question. I'm going to steal a little bit more time here, looking at the chat to try to get some of it. So you guys can all jump in and keep adding the chat speakers to all the questions. I'm wondering if you guys want to have this broad question, right? Both for the scientific community, for journal policies, funder policies, and the public. When we talk about these results, there's two sides, and I think it's pretty easy when someone's like, "Yep, I know what it means to reproduce something." Although maybe that's not easy, right? Because we're using approximate and exact. So it's actually not as easy as we thought, just to be very clear. But I'm going to ask the opposite question, which is, and you've all talked about it, but in terms of how to think about when something doesn't reproduce, right? If you're like, this did not reproduce. And again, each of you talked about the challenges of takes time, I need access to resources. There is, of course, error in there, right? Naturally, that exists. So if the speakers want to say something at that level, I think there's a lot of people that are kind of asking those types of questions, which is how do you guys interpret a failure to reproduce? And I know that's a really hard question. So let's try it though in the last couple of minutes.
Yeah, I'll go fast this way. Others can jump in. I think, I would bring it back even like when I see a new study, I don't believe it, especially if it's a novel result. I just don't buy it 100%. I would need 4 or 5 other studies to confirm it before I would start to believe in it. And in a way, that's because other people are going to use new data or different models, or they're going to try different ways to answer the same question, which is kind of what we do with reproducibility. Like that's one of the thing we're interested in, and with robustness checks. So when there's new information that comes in as a consumer of research, if I see that someone else finds it's not robust, or there's coding errors or problems, or the authors don't share their data and codes at all, are not interested in transparency, I update my beliefs about whether I believe this result or not. So to me, it's the same way as people outside of academia should think of it, and policymakers. And the more information, the better. I can make a more informed decision or judgment, or my beliefs about the results or claims of a specific paper change based on the information. So I want the most information possible. That's why I think it's super important to do robustness checks and check reproducibility as a first step before even thinking of replicability with new data. But that's my way of thinking of it.
So somebody else want to chime in there?
Yeah, I think this is an important question, and I saw a previous Q&A question about, does this imply QRPs? And I'm not sure that it does. Certainly there's the case for non-robust and non-replicate research that raises other questions. When I see a failure to reproduce, I see scientists who are under a lot of competing pressures to do a lot of different things, and it takes a lot of time to create packages that can precisely reproduce results. It's critically important. It's the foundation of critical research. But I see cross-pressured scientists who maybe don't have the support from journal policies or funders that they need to implement this important step. It doesn't absolve them of that responsibility, but I see structural features rather than questionable research necessarily.
Yeah, I just agree. It's more important to fix these institutional structural problems. So in our case, I think if it would have been mandatory to submit some code, it would have been more easy for us to reproduce the articles, because after years, the authors found very chaotic materials on their computers. Often they were not even sure whether which code relates to which article. And very often we missed something like README files. So some authors just provided us literally hundreds of different files with an email, good luck, to figure out which code to run first. So this is really what journals could fix with clear instruction, mandatory code sharing, and that's, I think, what is important to explore. So how can we improve the system And also this volunteers dilemma that people who share their code might be singled out with errors, while the ones not sharing code, we just cannot so easily detect some coding errors. So it should really become the norm.
This is a really important point. I want to hold on this. Like what these results are saying is what could be reproduced with the time and resources given. You can always, if you invest more and more time into it, get the same results, right? You can sort through hundreds of files to find the exact thing you need. That's not the question. The question is, can this be quickly, reliably done at scale? Because that's what's going to enable us to do more scrutiny. Um, and the more supportive infrastructure is in place and the more authors take this seriously, just the lower the friction point is between trying to reproduce it and actually reproducing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just to add an anecdote to that, we had several authors in our sample responding to our email saying, "Oh, it's a shame you're asking this now. I have no idea where that code is. Only if I had to submit it during submission, then it would have been fine if it was on the journal website." I mean, that might be an excuse, sure, but I think in general, authors sometimes even it can prevent them from losing their stuff basically if they have to submit it during publication or before publication. So yeah, some authors actually said they would have preferred they had to share their code earlier.
That's excellent. We are at time. This is the best part, and it's always the worst. The hardest thing is to stop it when we're having a good conversation. I think this was a good ending point, right? In the sense of really, to me, it's always trying to think about why these efforts. Again, it's wonderful to have the three of you because we covered a huge volume of what's going on and showing there's a lot of improvement to be done and normalizing this, having this webinar, the way that we're publishing these results, engaging early career researchers in these results, trying to think about ways to improve the system as we were just talking about. I think wonderful to have all of you on here. Thanks everyone for attending. And just as a final note, we'll make sure that everyone who registered gets to see this webinar as well to make sure that they were able to get access to the transcript and everything. But want to thank you speakers one more time for your presentations and your time here talking. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.